Get on the floor. Nobody moves, nobody breathes, or I start pulling triggers." The scream shattered the elegant hum of the dining room. Porcelain shattered against the mahogany floor. A woman shrieked in sudden, piercing terror. Addison froze in place, her silver serving tray slipping from trembling hands as three men in heavy tactical gear stormed through the brass-handled oak doors, leveling matte black rifles at the terrified patrons. Behind the polished marble espresso bar, Grayson stopped wiping the counter. For 3 years, he had been the quietest waiter in the city. Invisible, meek, a man who apologized when others bumped into him. But as a gunman violently grabbed Addison by the hair, the mild-mannered waiter vanished. Grayson slowly untied his apron. The monster he had buried was waking up. Laura was a sanctuary of wealth, a place where the scent of truffles and seared wagyu insulated the elite from the city's grit. Moving through this world of privilege was Grayson, a man built from forgettable details. With his muted gray hair and a perpetual apologetic slouch, he looked less like a man and more like a part of the wainscoting. He was a master of the invisible arts, refilling glasses and clearing plates without ever being noticed. Most importantly, Grayson was a master at taking abuse, absorbing the arrogance of the ultra-rich without a flicker of emotion. Addison, the floor manager, was a hurricane of nervous energy who held a protective soft spot for him. To her, Grayson was like a delicate, aging uncle who had wandered into the brutal crossfire of high-end hospitality. One evening, a hedge fund manager berated Grayson over the temperature of his soup, his finger jabbing at Grayson's chest. "Are you incompetent, old man?" the man spat. Grayson stood perfectly still, his head bowed. Behind his dull eyes, he was calculating the force needed to collapse the man's windpipe or the distance to the serrated steak knife on the table. Instead, he simply took a deep breath. "I am incredibly sorry, sir," Grayson murmured, his voice stripped of pride. "I will have the chef prepare a fresh bowl immediately." Addison quickly stepped in to shield him, later telling him, "You have dignity, Grayson. You're allowed to defend yourself." Grayson only offered a polite nod. He knew that his submission wasn't weakness. It was the lock on a very dark cage. For him, being invisible was a necessary penance, the only thing keeping the world safe from the man he used to be. As the restaurant grew quiet after the rush, the anchors of the present often slipped for Grayson. Polishing crystal highball glasses, the amber lights of Laura would blur into the harsh neon of a Chicago warehouse. He could still smell the metallic tang of blood and hear the echoes of men begging for their lives. The cold, detached voice ordering their executions had been his own. Grayson squeezed his eyes shut, using grounding techniques to anchor himself to the scent of citrus cleaner. He was Grayson now. He paid taxes. He was harmless. "You always look a million miles away," Addison said, leaning against the espresso machine. She studied him, her hair escaping its pins after the long shift. "I know you said you worked in logistics, but sometimes it feels like you've lived 10 different lifetimes. You carry yourself like someone who knows a secret about the world." Grayson lied smoothly about inventory, but Addison wasn't convinced. She remembered how he hadn't flinched when a tray of flutes fell the week before, catching a glass midair without even looking. A lucky catch, he had insisted. As Addison reached across the bar, her elbow clipped a heavy brass cocktail shaker. It plummeted toward the tile floor. In a fraction of a second, Grayson's left hand snapped out a blur of lethal, instinctive speed. He didn't just catch it, he absorbed its momentum perfectly, placing it back on the counter before Addison had even turned her head. The silence that followed was electric. Addison stared at the shaker, then at Grayson. For a split second, she didn't see a frail waiter. She saw something predatory and wound tight. "Lucky catch," Grayson repeated, forcing his shoulders to slump and his hand to develop a slight tremor. As she walked away, Grayson's heart hammered in a powerful rhythm. The reflexes were sharpening. No matter how hard he tried to dull them, he knew the truth. You can strip a king of his empire, but you can never take the violence out of the man. It just waits in the dark, patient and hungry, for a reason to wake up. The following Tuesday night began with an oppressive, suffocating heaviness in the air. A massive, unseasonal stormfront had rolled in from the east, blanketing the city in a bruised, violet twilight hours before the sun was officially meant to set. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the financial district, driving sheets of freezing, torrential rain against Laura's reinforced floor-to-ceiling front windows. Inside, the restaurant was a fortress of warmth and exclusionary luxury, but the violent weather outside seemed to infect the atmosphere within. The patrons were louder than usual, their laughter edged with a manic, nervous energy. The waitstaff moved with a hurried, erratic tempo, dropping cutlery and bumping into one another in the narrow aisles. It was one of those strange, electric nights where the air pressure drops and the human animal instinctively senses that something terrible is hunting in the dark. Grayson felt it in his bones long before he saw any physical evidence of danger. It was an ancient, primal itch at the base of his skull, an icy prickle of pure adrenaline that had saved his life 100 times in the dark alleys and bloody boardrooms of his former life. His senses, usually kept forcefully suppressed, began to involuntarily dial themselves up to a terrifying degree of acuity. He could suddenly hear the individual heartbeats of the people at his tables. He could smell the subtle, metallic scent of nervous sweat beneath the overpowering fog of expensive French perfumes. He began to map the room not as a dining space, but as a tactical environment. He silently catalogued the blind spots, the fatal funnels, the structural integrity of the oak tables, and the specific locations of the heavy cast-iron skillets in the open kitchen. He was standing near the host stand, ostensibly organizing the leather-bound wine menus, when his eyes locked onto the street outside. Through the distortion of the driving rain and the heavy condensation on the glass, he saw it. A matte black, heavily armored luxury SUV pulled up to the curb directly in front of the restaurant. It didn't park in a designated spot. It idled aggressively in the drop-off zone, its massive engine rumbling with a deep, predatory vibration that Grayson could feel through the soles of his shoes. The windows were tinted an illegal, impenetrable black. No valet ran out to greet it with an umbrella. It just sat there, a silent, menacing monolith in the downpour. Grayson's breathing slowed. His posture, usually slouched and deferential, straightened by a fraction of an inch. His eyes narrowed, scanning the geometry of the vehicle. Heavy suspension, reinforced tires. The chassis sat low, indicating a massive amount of internal weight. Weapons, body armor, men. He moved quickly, his steps silent as he crossed the dining room toward Addison. She was standing near the bar, furiously tapping at a tablet, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, as she tried to reorganize a seating chart for a VIP party that had shown up 40 minutes late. "Addison," Grayson said, his voice lower and much firmer than its usual subservient pitch. "I believe we should lock the secondary entrances, the kitchen alley door and the patio access." Addison didn't look up from her screen. "Grayson, please, not right now. The senator's party just arrived with 3 extra guests, and the kitchen is already in the weeds with the halibut orders. We can't lock the patio access. The smokers will throw an absolute fit if they have to go out the front. The weather is exceptionally violent." Grayson pressed, stepping closer, positioning his body subtly between her and the front windows. "It is drawing an unsavory element to the streets, the kind of element looking for warmth and opportunity. We should secure the perimeter. I can handle the complaints. Addison finally looked up, her expression a mix of profound exhaustion and mild irritation. She looked at Grayson, expecting to see the timid, cautious old man she knew. Instead, she saw a terrifying intensity in his gray eyes, a cold, focused urgency that made the hair on her arms stand up. For a fleeting second, he didn't look like a waiter at all. He looked like a commander on the eve of a massacre. "Grayson, what is wrong with you tonight?" she asked, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "You're acting paranoid. It's just rain. We are in the safest, most heavily patrolled neighborhood in the entire city. Nobody is going to bother us." Before Grayson could argue further, the heavy passenger doors of the black SUV swung open simultaneously. Through the rain, Grayson watched the men step out onto the pavement. There were 4 of them. They did not run for cover from the freezing downpour. They moved with a slow, deliberate, heavy-footed arrogance. They wore dark, bulky tactical jackets that failed. They wore black ski masks pulled down over their faces, leaving only their eyes exposed. Eyes that swept the street with the cold, dead efficiency of seasoned predators. Grayson recognized the walk. He recognized the tactical spacing. This was not a random robbery. This was not a crime of opportunity driven by desperation. This was a highly organized, heavily armed hit squad, and they were walking with absolute purpose toward the brass-handled front doors of Laura. There was no time left for warnings. There was no time to explain. The storm had arrived. Grayson didn't speak another word to Addison. He turned his back on her, his mind running through a million terrifying calculations per second. He grabbed a heavy, solid wood pepper grinder from a nearby table, his fingers wrapping around it not like a culinary tool, but like a blunt force baton. He moved toward the front of the restaurant, sliding into the deep shadows near the coat check, making himself as small and invisible as possible. He was out of time to be a savior. He had to become a ghost. He took one final deep breath, burying the persona of Grayson, the meek waiter, deep in the recesses of his mind. He let the cold, mathematical, utterly ruthless core of his true self take the wheel. The brass handles of the front doors began to turn. The gathering storm was about to break the glass. The brass handles turned with a heavy, metallic click. But the doors were not simply opened. They were violently breached. A massive steel-toed boot kicked the right oak door with the force of a battering ram, shattering the reinforced locking mechanism and sending the heavy wood slamming against the interior wall with an explosive crash that sounded like a bomb detonating. The sound instantly killed the ambient hum of the restaurant. The jazz music seemed to choke and die in the air. For a single, terrifying microsecond, the entire dining room was frozen in a tableau of shock. 100 faces turned toward the entrance, forks suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses halted mid-toast. Then, the nightmare poured in. 4 men flooded through the shattered entrance, bringing the freezing rain and the howling wind with them. They moved with terrifying speed and brutal military precision, fanning out instantly to establish total dominance over the chaotic space. They didn't shout immediately. Their sheer, imposing physical presence and the horrifying, undeniable reality of the matte black, suppressed automatic rifles they leveled at the crowd did the communicating for them. "Get on the floor! Nobody moves, nobody breathes, or I start pulling triggers," the leader finally roared, his voice artificially amplified and distorted by the heavy fabric of his tactical mask. It was a raw, jagged sound that scraped against the eardrums. Panic, sudden and absolute, erupted. A woman in a glittering evening gown shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror that broke the spell of silence. Chaos consumed the room. Patrons scrambled, chairs tipping over, crystal shattering as tables were violently knocked aside. People dove beneath the white linen tablecloths, weeping, praying, curling into tight, helpless balls of fear. The gunmen did not hesitate to enforce their authority. The man on the far left stepped forward and brutally swung the heavy polymer stock of his rifle into the jaw of a young, terrified waiter who hadn't dropped to the floor fast enough. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the room, and the boy crumpled instantly, blood pooling on the polished mahogany. Face down, hands on the back of your heads. If I see a phone, you die. If you look at me, you die, the leader bellowed, striding down the center aisle, his heavy boots crunching over broken plates and spilled truffles. He scanned the room, his eyes cold and methodical, searching for the person in charge. His gaze locked onto Addison. Addison was standing near the bar, paralyzed by a terror so profound it had entirely hijacked her nervous system. She couldn't scream. She couldn't drop to the floor. She could only stare, her eyes wide and unblinking, as the nightmare walked toward her. The leader closed the distance in 3 massive strides. He reached out with a thick, leather-gloved hand, grabbing a fistful of her dark hair, and violently yanked her forward. Addison let out a choked, desperate gasp of pain as she was thrown off balance, her knees crashing hard into the hardwood floor. "You're the manager," the leader stated, pressing the scorching hot, suppressed barrel of his rifle directly against the side of her neck. He didn't ask. He knew. "You have exactly 30 seconds to take me to the back office and open the main safe. If you stutter, if you stall, or if you tell me you don't have the combination, I will blow a hole in your neck and ask the sous chef. Do you understand me?" From the deep shadows of the coat-check alcove, Grayson watched the entire horrific sequence unfold. He was crouched on one knee, completely still, his breathing perfectly regulated, his heart rate terrifyingly slow and steady. To the untrained eye, he looked like another terrified hostage hiding in the dark. But internally, a titanic, agonizing war was raging. If he stayed hidden, he would survive. He could play the terrified old man, lie on the floor with his hands on his head, and let the men rob the safe. They would leave, the police would arrive, and his meticulously constructed life of quiet obscurity would remain perfectly intact. The syndicate he had fled would never know he was here. The ghosts of his past would remain buried. But as he watched the thick, gloved hand twist in Addison's hair, as he saw the barrel of the rifle pressing into her soft skin, as he heard the quiet, broken whimpers escaping her lips, the cold, pragmatic logic of survival began to crack. Addison had treated him with kindness. She had protected his fragile cover. She was an innocent caught in a world of wolves. Grayson closed his eyes. The memory of the innocent collateral damage from his past life, the faces of the people who had died because he had prioritized his own empire, flashed violently through his mind. He had sworn to never be the cause of violence again, but he had also sworn never to let violence happen in his presence if he had the power to stop it. He opened his eyes. The dull, subservient gray fog that had clouded them for 3 years vanished entirely. In its place was an absolute, terrifying clarity. The stooped posture evaporated. The muscles in his back and shoulders, dormant but thick with decades of lethal muscle memory, tensed and coiled like heavy steel springs. He was no longer Grayson, the waiter, the man who folded napkins and apologized for cold soup. The lock on the cage shattered. The monster stepped out into the dark. He analyzed the geometry of the room with the speed of a supercomputer. 4 targets, heavy armor, automatic weapons. Leader focused on the hostage. Rear guard near the door, distracted by the crying patrons. Left flank moving toward the kitchen. Right flank guarding the center aisle. Grayson slowly stood up from the shadows. He didn't make a sound. He gripped the heavy, solid wood pepper grinder in his right hand. It wasn't a gun, but in his hands, it was enough. The time for hiding was over. The executioner had returned to the floor. Grayson moved out of the coat-check alcove with a terrifying, fluid silence. He didn't run. Running wasted energy and created noise. He flowed forward, stepping over a fallen chair with the grace of a predatory cat, his eyes locked entirely on the rear guard stationed by the shattered front doors. The man was young, his posture slightly relaxed, his attention drawn toward the weeping patrons huddled beneath the window tables. He was arrogant, assuming the sheer shock of their entry had entirely neutralized any potential threat. That arrogance was a fatal error. Closing the distance from the shadows, Grayson struck before the man even registered a presence behind him. This was not the flashy, wide-swinging combat of action movies. This was the brutal, microscopic, and incredibly ugly science of biological destruction. Grayson didn't aim for the heavy ceramic plates of the man's body armor. He aimed for the fragile, exposed machinery of the human body. With his left hand, Grayson clamped brutally over the gunman's mouth and nose, violently snapping the man's head back to expose his throat and cutting off any chance of a warning shout. Simultaneously, his right hand, gripping the heavy wooden pepper grinder like a piston, drove upward in a devastating compact strike directly into the cluster of nerves at the brachial plexus just under the man's armpit. The gunman's body instantly seized. The severe nerve shock short-circuited his nervous system, causing his arm to go completely dead. The heavy rifle slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. Before the weapon could hit the floor and make a sound, Grayson trapped it against his own body with his knee. Without pausing for even a fraction of a second, Grayson shifted his weight, using the man's own off-balance momentum to drag him backward into the deep shadows near the coat racks. Once concealed, Grayson applied a rapid, terrifyingly precise sleeper hold, cutting off the carotid arteries. Within 3 seconds, the man's eyes rolled back, and he went entirely limp, unconscious, and effectively neutralized. Grayson lowered the body gently to the floor to prevent a thud. He quickly stripped the heavy tactical knife from the man's vest and slid it into his own waistband, leaving the rifle behind. An automatic rifle in a crowded room was a liability, prone to overpenetration and civilian casualties. He preferred the intimate, surgical control of close-quarters combat. Target 1 was down. 3 remained. He moved back into the dim lighting of the dining room, creeping down the side aisle toward the bar. The right flank gunman was slowly walking among the tables, occasionally kicking a patron to ensure they stayed down, his rifle sweeping the room in lazy arcs. He was 10 feet away from Grayson, completely unaware that the geometry of the room had just fundamentally altered. Grayson picked up a thick, heavy ceramic soup tureen that had fallen perfectly intact onto the carpet. He weighed it in his hand for a microsecond, calculating trajectory, velocity, and impact. He stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar and hurled the ceramic bowl with the speed and precision of a major league pitcher. The heavy tureen struck the right flank gunman squarely on the side of his tactical helmet with a sickening, hollow crack. The impact didn't penetrate the armor, but the sheer kinetic transfer of force violently whipped the man's head to the side, severely disorienting him and causing him to stagger sideways, his rifle dipping toward the floor. Before the ceramic shards had even settled on the carpet, Grayson was on him. He covered the 10 feet in 2 massive, explosive strides. As the dazed gunman tried to swing his rifle up, Grayson's hands were already there. He didn't try to wrestle the gun away. He attacked the biomechanics of the man holding it. He grabbed the barrel of the rifle, redirecting it toward the ceiling, while his right palm delivered a devastating palm-heel strike to the underside of the man's jaw. The strike violently snapped the man's jaw shut, rattling his brain against his skull. As the gunman's knees buckled from the concussion, Grayson seamlessly transitioned, stepping inside the man's guard. He wrapped his arm around the gunman's extended, weapon-holding limb, applying a brutal, hyperextending joint lock to the elbow. A sharp, wet snapping sound echoed through the immediate area as the joint failed. The man screamed, dropping the weapon instantly. Grayson silenced the scream with a swift, ruthlessly precise knee strike to the solar plexus, driving all the oxygen from the man's lungs. The second gunman collapsed to the floor in a twitching, agonized heap, entirely incapacitated. The sudden scuffle, though brutally fast, was not entirely silent. The sharp crack of the ceramic and the muffled scream finally alerted the remaining two men. Near the espresso bar, the leader whirled around, dragging a sobbing Addison up with him, using her body as a physical shield. The left flank gunman, who had been moving toward the kitchen, spun around, leveling his rifle at the shadows where Grayson had just dismantled his partner. "What the hell was that? Talk to me!" The leader roared into his radio headset, panic suddenly bleeding into his artificially distorted voice. He got only dead static in return. Addison, her eyes wide with terror, looked past the barrel of the gun pressed against her head. Through her tear-blurred vision, she saw a figure standing over the broken body of the figure straightened up, stepping out of the shadows and into the soft amber light of the dining room. It was Grayson, but it wasn't the man she knew. His face was entirely devoid of the gentle, apologetic warmth she was accustomed to. It was a mask of cold, terrifying granite. His eyes were dead, calculating, and completely empty of fear. He stood amidst the shattered crystal and weeping patrons like a dark god of violence who had just descended onto a battlefield. Addison's breath hitched in her throat. The man who had carefully folded napkins, the man who had silently taken abuse over cold soup, had just dismantled two heavily armed mercenaries with his bare hands in a matter of seconds. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Nobody knew the waiter. Nobody knew what he was. But the awakening had happened, and there was no putting the monster back in the cage. "Kill him! Put him down now!" the leader screamed, shoving Addison forcefully against the polished mahogany of the bar and raising his own rifle. The left flank gunman opened fire. The deafening, rhythmic crack, crack, crack of suppressed automatic weapon fire tore through the restaurant, infinitely louder than any movie had ever portrayed. Wood splintered, plaster exploded from the walls, and the remaining crystal chandeliers shattered, raining sharp, deadly diamonds down onto the screaming patrons below. But Grayson was already gone. At the very moment the leader shouted the order, Grayson had violently thrown himself sideways, executing a perfect rolling dive behind the massive, solid marble foundation of the host stand. Bullets chewed through the thin wood paneling above his head, raining sharp splinters and dust down onto his shoulders. He didn't flinch. His mind was entirely devoid of panic. It was processing the chaos with cold, clinical efficiency, operating entirely on the deeply ingrained algorithms of urban warfare. He was outgunned, out-armored, and protecting a room full of soft targets. A direct assault was statistical suicide. He needed to alter the battlefield. He needed to control the environment. "Move! Kitchen! Now!" Grayson's voice boomed through the restaurant, cutting through the gunfire and the screaming. It was not the soft, gravelly stammer of an old waiter. It was a resonant, terrifying baritone, a voice that had commanded thousands of men, a voice that expected absolute, immediate obedience. The sheer authority in the command broke the paralysis of the patrons nearest the back of the room. A few brave souls scrambled to their feet, crawling and running desperately toward the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen. Grayson had to buy them time, and he had to secure Addison. He reached up, his fingers blindly finding the heavy brass base of a massive decorative floor lamp. With a primal grunt of exertion, he heaved the heavy lamp outward, hurling it directly into the path of the left flank gunman. The man tripped over the heavy brass base, his rifle fire spraying wildly into the ceiling, bringing down a shower of acoustic tiles and dust. Using the momentary distraction, Grayson surged out from behind the host stand, staying incredibly low to the ground. He grabbed a heavy metal serving tray from a fallen cart, holding it up not as armor, it wouldn't stop a rifle round, but as a visual obstruction, disrupting the gunman's line of sight. He sprinted the short distance to the bar, sliding across the blood-slicked hardwood floor until he crashed into the wooden paneling right beside where Addison was huddled, weeping uncontrollably, her hands clamped over her ears. "Addison," Grayson snapped, his voice hard, sharp, and entirely devoid of comfort. He reached out and grabbed her shoulder, shaking her slightly to break her shock. Look at me right now." She forced her eyes open, staring at him with a mixture of desperate relief and profound horror. "Grayson, what are you doing?" she stammered, hyperventilating. "I am saving your life, but you have to move when I tell you. Do you understand?" He didn't wait for her answer. He reached behind the bar, his hand finding the main electrical breaker box hidden beneath the register. He ripped the metal door open and violently pulled the master switch down. Instantly, Laura plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The sudden absence of light was a physical shock. The screaming intensified, amplifying the chaos. The gunmen, temporarily blinded by the sudden transition, stopped firing, their night vision ruined by the sudden shift. "Now," Grayson whispered harshly. He hauled Addison to her feet, wrapping a strong arm around her waist, physically supporting her weight as he dragged her behind the bar and toward the kitchen doors. He moved entirely by memory, knowing the exact layout of the restaurant blind. He navigated around spilled ice, broken stools, and terrified, crawling patrons, his hand resting heavily on the tactical knife tucked into his waistband. They burst through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The emergency backup lights had kicked on here, bathing the stainless steel counters and industrial stoves in a harsh, sickly red glow. A dozen patrons and kitchen staff were huddled in the corners, weeping and clutching each other. Grayson let go of Addison and immediately went to work. He was a general fortifying a bunker. He moved to the heavy industrial rolling prep tables. "You three, help me push this. Now." He barked at a group of terrified line cooks. The absolute command in his voice compelled them to obey. Together, they shoved 3 massive steel prep tables against the swinging doors, creating a heavy metallic barricade. He didn't stop. He moved to the knife rack, violently pulling down 3 long, heavy chef's knives. He handed one to a burly dishwasher. "If anyone comes through that door who isn't wearing a suit, you stab them in the neck. Do not hesitate." The dishwasher took the knife with trembling hands, nodding dumbly. Addison leaned against a stainless steel sink, clutching her chest, her breath coming in ragged, tearing gasps. She watched Grayson move, the efficiency, the coldness, the utter lack of fear. He was treating the kitchen like a military installation. He was checking sightlines, gathering makeshift weapons, a heavy cast-iron skillet, a pot of boiling pasta water left on a low simmer. "Grayson," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the sound of crying patrons. "Grayson, please. Who are you? You're not a waiter. You can't be." Grayson paused, turning slowly to look at her in the bloody red emergency light. He held the heavy cast-iron skillet in his hand, his knuckles white. The gentle facade was entirely gone, burned away by the adrenaline and the necessity of violence. He looked older, heavier, carrying the weight of 1,000 dark secrets. "I was a waiter, Addison," he said quietly, the cold baritone softening just a fraction. "For 3 years, I was exactly who I said I was. But before that, I was someone else entirely, someone you would have never hired, someone you should be very afraid of." Before she could process the weight of his words, a massive, thunderous impact hit the kitchen doors from the other side. The heavy steel barricade groaned and slid backward an inch. The gunmen had found them. The retreat was over. The final stand had begun. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen buckled inward with a metallic shriek, jarring the barricade of steel prep tables back another agonizing inch. The red emergency lighting flickered violently as the leader kicked the door again, the sheer brute force of the impact echoing through the tiled room like a bomb blast. The huddled patrons screamed, pressing themselves tighter against the far walls, trying to meld into the stainless steel refrigeration units. Grayson stood dead center in the room, perfectly still, his breathing slow and metronomic. He held the heavy black cast-iron skillet loosely in his right hand, angled slightly downward. In his left hand, hidden behind his thigh, he gripped the cold polymer handle of the tactical knife he had taken from the first guard. He was a statue of coiled, lethal potential, waiting for the breach. Push it back. Hold the line. Grayson barked to the terrified kitchen staff holding the tables, but it was useless. They were civilians, paralyzed by a fear they had never known existed. With a final, devastating crash, the hinges on the right door sheared off completely. The heavy wood splintered, and the door fell inward, crashing over the prep tables. Through the jagged opening, the leader climbed into the kitchen. His tactical mask was pushed up, revealing a face deeply scarred, sweating profusely, and twisted into a mask of pure, homicidal rage. He held his automatic rifle in one hand, and with the other, he dragged a bloodied, weeping busboy by the collar of his uniform, holding the boy up as a human shield. Behind the leader, the remaining gunman, the one who had fired wildly into the ceiling, stepped into the doorway, his weapon sweeping the corners of the room. "Nobody moves," the leader roared, his chest heaving, the barrel of his rifle pressed cruelly into the side of the young busboy's head. "Who the hell is doing this? Step out right now, or I blow this kid's brains all over the grill." Grayson did not hesitate. He did not cower. He stepped out from behind the cover of the central island, moving into the direct line of sight. He walked slowly, his posture unnervingly relaxed, his eyes locked entirely on the leader. He didn't look at the gun. He didn't look at the weeping hostage. He looked directly into the soul of the man holding them, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance. "Let the boy go," Grayson said. His voice was no longer loud. It was quiet, terrifyingly calm, carrying a chilling resonance that cut through the panic in the room. It was the voice of a man entirely comfortable with murder. "He is a child. He has no value to you. I am the one you want." The leader froze, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the figure standing in front of him. He was expecting a cop, an off-duty soldier, a heavily armed hero. He was not expecting an aging man in a blood-spattered waiter's vest holding a frying pan. But as the leader stared into Grayson's cold, dead gray eyes, the anger in his face slowly began to morph into something else. Confusion. Then, a creeping, primal recognition. He studied the way Grayson stood perfectly balanced, offering zero vulnerable targets. He recognized the specific, sociopathic deadness in the eyes. "No," the leader whispered, his voice suddenly losing its aggressive edge. The barrel of the rifle wavered slightly against the busboy's head. "No, that's impossible. You're dead. The Russians burned your compound in Palermo 3 years ago. There wasn't enough left of you to bury." The silence in the kitchen was suddenly heavier than the gunfire had been. Addison, crouched behind a counter, stared at Grayson, her mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of her. "The Russians? Palermo?" Grayson smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression that contained absolutely no joy. It was a smile that had ordered the deaths of entire families. "The Russians were very thorough," Grayson replied softly, taking one slow, deliberate step closer. But they were incredibly predictable. They burned a body. They didn't burn me. I came here to be quiet. I came here to fade away. And you, in your infinite, tragic stupidity, have dragged me back into the light. The leader swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his scarred cheek. His bravado was instantly evaporating, replaced by the deep, instinctual terror of a wolf suddenly realizing it has walked into the den of a bear. Don Vincenzo, he breathed, speaking the name like a curse. The ghost of Chicago. You're a waiter? I was. Grayson corrected him gently, taking another agonizingly slow step forward. I was an excellent waiter. I was polite, I was quiet, I was clean. But you brought mud into my house. You put your hands on my people. You broke my peace. The leader's hand began to tremble. The legendary status of the man standing before him was completely overwhelming his tactical training. He was facing a myth, a Bugoi man of the underworld who had supposedly butchered his way to the top of a criminal empire before vanishing into ash. I have a gun on the kid, the leader stammered, his voice cracking, trying desperately to regain control of the situation. You take one more step, and I kill him. I'll kill everyone in this room, Vincenzo. No, you won't, Grayson stated as a cold, absolute fact. Because you know exactly who I am. If you pull that trigger, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle you. I will keep you alive long enough to explain exactly how I'm going to find your family, your friends, and everyone you have ever loved. And I will erase them from the earth. You know I can do it. You know I will do it. Grayson stopped walking. He was exactly 6 feet away. Striking distance. Look at my hands, Grayson commanded, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, terrifying whisper. Look at the weapon I am holding. A pan. I am going to beat you to death with a piece of cookware, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me. Drop the boy. The psychological pressure in the room was unbearable. The leader's mind fractured. The myth of Don Vincenzo, combined with the terrifying, predatory reality standing in front of him, broke his nerve entirely. For a microscopic fraction of a second, the leader's eyes darted from Grayson to the frying pan, his grip on the busboy loosening as he prepared to shift his aim to the true threat. That fraction of a second was all the ghost of Chicago needed. The talking was over. The violence was here. The violence erupted with blinding, terrifying speed, shattering the psychological standoff in an instant. The moment the leader's eyes flicked downward, Grayson moved. The heavy cast-iron skillet didn't swing in a wide, cinematic arc. Grayson snapped his wrist, hurling the heavy black iron like a massive, blunt throwing star directly at the leader's face. The skillet crashed violently into the leader's tactical helmet with a sickening, metallic clong. The raw kinetic force didn't crush his skull, but it violently snapped his head backward, disorienting him completely and causing his finger to involuntarily jerk on the trigger. A short, erratic burst of suppressed gunfire chewed into the ceiling tiles, raining plaster down as the leader stumbled backward, his grip on the weeping busboy failing entirely. The boy dropped to the floor, scrambling desperately away on his hands and knees. The line of fire was clear. The second gunman, still standing in the shattered doorway, raised his rifle to fire at Grayson. But Grayson was already in motion, his mind calculating vectors and trajectories faster than conscious thought. As he hurled the skillet, his left hand had simultaneously snatched the handle of a massive, heavy aluminum stockpot, simmering on the commercial stove beside him. With a roar of pure, unleashed exertion, Grayson swung the heavy pot. Gallons of scalding, near-boiling water erupted through the air in a massive, sweeping wave, catching the second gunman square in the chest and face. The man shrieked a high, bubbling scream of absolute agony, The boiling water bypassed his heavy body armor entirely, seeping instantly into his tactical vest and scalding the exposed skin of his neck and face. He dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his face as he collapsed backward through the doorway, writhing on the floor of the dining room, entirely neutralized by the searing pain. Grayson did not pause to watch him fall. He pivoted, his focus locking entirely back onto the leader, who was just shaking off the massive concussion from the skillet impact. Raising his weapon with trembling hands, Grayson closed the final 3 feet in a single explosive lunge. He didn't try to block the gun. He ducked under the barrel, stepping deeply inside the man's guard, entirely inside his personal space. His left hand shot up, driving the tactical knife he had stolen earlier straight up into the soft, unarmored gap beneath the leader's armpit, burying the blade to the hilt. The leader gasped, a wet, choking sound, as the blade severed muscle and punctured his lung. The rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the tile floor. But Grayson wasn't finished. He pulled the knife out with a violent twist, dropping it. He grabbed the leader by the thick tactical vest with both hands, using his own body weight and momentum to violently hurl the much larger man backward. The leader crashed backward onto a heavy stainless steel prep table, sliding across it and knocking a cascade of metal bowls and utensils to the floor in a deafening crash. Before the leader could even attempt to roll off the table, Grayson was on top of him. The terrifying, cold calculation was gone now, replaced by the raw, brutal necessity of finishing the fight. Grayson rained down a series of devastating, hammer-like blows, using the heel of his palm, targeting the man's shattered jaw, his throat, the soft cartilage of his nose. Each strike landed with a sickening, wet thud, breaking bone and driving the fight entirely out of the mercenary. The leader weakly raised a hand to defend himself, his eyes rolling back in his head, blood pouring from his nose and mouth. Grayson grabbed the man's extended wrist, twisted it violently until the joint popped, and delivered one final, crushing elbow strike directly to the man's temple. The leader's body went completely limp, sliding off the edge of the steel table and hitting the floor like a sack of wet cement. He didn't move. He didn't twitch. He was alive, but he would not be waking up for a very long time. The sudden, absolute silence in the kitchen was heavier than the gunfire had been. The only sounds were the ragged, gasping breaths of the hostages, the hiss of the gas burners, and the steady, dripping sound of the leader's blood pooling on the white tile floor. Grayson stood over the broken body. His chest heaved, pulling in huge, oxygen-starved breaths. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, the knuckles of his left hand already swelling. He looked down at his clothes. The immaculate white waiter's shirt was smeared with blood, grease, and dirt. The carefully constructed disguise of 3 years was entirely, irrevocably destroyed. Slowly, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion that settled deep into his bones. He wiped a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his trembling hand and turned to face the room. The terrified patrons, the line cooks, the busboy, they were all staring at him, but the look in their eyes was not gratitude. It was not the relief of hostages who had just been saved by a hero. It was absolute, unfiltered terror. They pressed themselves against the walls, shrinking away from him, their eyes wide and trembling. They had seen the men with the guns, but they had also just seen the monster who had torn those men apart with his bare hands. They feared the savior far more than the attackers. Grayson's gaze finally found Addison. She was still crouched by the sink, her hands covering her mouth, her tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She looked at him as if staring at a ghost, a demon wearing the skin of a man she thought she knew. She trembled violently, unable to look away from the blood on his hands. Grayson felt a heavy, cold weight settle over his heart. This was the tragedy of his existence. He could save them, but he could never be one of them. The violence he carried was a contagion, and simply witnessing it was enough to poison their perception of him forever. He lowered his head, the terrifying aura of the Mafia boss fading, replaced once again by the deep, profound sorrow of an old, tired man. The battle was won, but his sanctuary was burned to the ground. In the heavy, oppressive silence of the kitchen, the wail of approaching police sirens finally bled through the reinforced walls. It started as a distant, reedy whine, but rapidly escalated into a chorus of screaming, overlapping tones that cut through the driving rain outside. Through the shattered front windows of the dining room, the frantic flashing of red and blue emergency lights began to pulse, casting harsh, strobing shadows across the bloodied, ruined interior of Laura. Grayson stood frozen for a moment, listening to the sirens draw closer. The sound was a definitive timer. He knew exactly how municipal police tactical units operated. They would secure the perimeter within 2 minutes. They would breach the building within 5. Once they were inside, nobody would be allowed to leave. They would take statements, they would run fingerprints, and they would process the DNA left on the coffee pots, the knives, and the broken bodies of the mercenaries. If Grayson stayed, the biometric scanners at the precinct would light up like a slot machine. The name Grayson would vanish, replaced by his true identity. The ghosts of his past, the syndicates he had betrayed, the rivals he had ruined, the federal agencies that had hunted him for decades, would all know exactly where he was. The peace he had bled for would be entirely over. He had to vanish, and he had to do it immediately. He looked down at his hands, wiping the worst of the blood off onto a clean white dish towel he snatched from a nearby counter. His movements were rapid, precise, stripped of any emotion. He was shifting back into survival mode. He moved to the back door of the kitchen, the heavy steel exit that led out into the narrow, trash-filled alleyway. He placed his hand on the push bar but stopped, turning his head slowly to look back at the room one last time. The patrons were still huddled in terror, their eyes locked on him, too afraid to even speak. But Grayson was only looking for one face. Addison was slowly standing up, using the edge of the stainless steel sink for support. Her legs were trembling, and she looked exceptionally pale under the harsh red emergency light. She took a hesitant step toward him, entirely ignoring the bodies on the floor. "Grayson," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely audible over the approaching sirens. "The police are here. You saved us. You have to stay. They need to know what you did. You're a hero." Grayson offered her a small, sad smile that carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. It was the most genuine expression he had worn in 3 years. "I am many things, Addison, but I have never been a hero," he said, his voice soft, returning almost to the gentle cadence of the waiter she had known. "Heroes can stand in the light. I belong in the shadows. If I stay here, the men who sent these amateurs will eventually come looking for me, and they will bring a war to your doorstep that you cannot possibly survive." He took a step toward her, and instinctively she flinched, pulling back slightly. The microscopic movement tore at him, but he understood it perfectly. The illusion was broken. "I am sorry," Grayson said softly, the sorrow in his voice profound and absolute. "I am deeply sorry that I brought this violence into your sanctuary. I came here looking for a quiet place to disappear, and you gave me that. You were kind to me, Addison. You treated an old ghost like a human being. I will never forget that." Tears spilled over Addison's eyelashes, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice pleading for a reality she could understand. "Please, just tell me who you really are." Grayson shook his head slowly. The blue and red lights from the alleyway flashed through the small window in the back door, illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion on his face. "I was a waiter," Grayson said, his voice thick with finality. "I was a man who folded napkins and cleaned glasses. And you were a good boss. That is the only truth that matters tonight. If the police ask, you tell them a man fought back, but you didn't see his face in the dark. Tell them he ran. Forget me, Addison. For your own safety, forget I ever existed." The squeal of heavy tires braking violently on wet pavement echoed from the street out front. The SWAT teams had arrived. The heavy thump of boots hitting the pavement and the shouting of tactical commands filtered through the ruined building. The time was up. Grayson turned his back on her. He pushed the heavy steel bar on the alley door. It swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind and horizontal rain. He stepped out into the dark, filthy alleyway. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He simply stepped into the storm, pulling the collar of his ruined, bloodied shirt up against the cold. Inside, Addison rushed to the open door, gripping the frame as she stared out into the darkness. "Grayson!" she called out, her voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind and the shrieking sirens. But there was no answer. The alley was empty. The rain washed away his footprints before they could even form. The mild-mannered waiter, the man who had effortlessly dismantled an armed death squad to protect her, was gone. He had vanished back into the violent, invisible currents of the world, a ghost once again, condemned to wander in the dark so that people like her could continue to live in the light. We never truly know the heavy burdens others carry beneath their quiet, unassuming exteriors, nor the dark, violent pasts they may have buried in a desperate attempt to find a sliver of peace. True strength is not simply the capacity for overwhelming power, but the agonizing restraint required to choose humility over ego, and the courage to sacrifice one's own sanctuary to protect the innocent. Grayson's story reminds us that the quietest people often fight the loudest internal wars. If this intense cinematic story kept you on the edge of your seat, please leave a like, share it with fellow lovers of dramatic storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, thrilling tales.